The morning room at Vane House smelled of cold ash and yesterday's roses. Charlotte stood at the writing desk near the window, the household accounts open before her, and worked through the column of figures with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be thanked for it. Outside, the village of Alderton was waking in the grey November light. A cart horse moving slowly up the high street, a woman shaking a cloth from an upper window 2 houses along. Charlotte recorded a sum in the ledger, blotted it, and moved to the next line. She was 23 years old, the elder daughter of the late Mr. Vane of Alderton, and she had been managing her mother's correspondence, her mother's accounts, and a considerable portion of her mother's domestic arrangements since her father died 4 years prior. She was not thanked for this. She was not noticed for it, which amounted to the same thing inside the economy of the Vane household. What she was noticed for, in her mother's estimation, was the £800 settled on her by her father's will, which had always been described in that house as Charlotte's one substantial recommendation, and which Lady Vane had taken to invoking in company as though the sum were a piece of furniture Charlotte carried about with her wherever she went. The fire had not been laid. Charlotte crossed to the grate, found the tinderbox on the mantel shelf where Briggs always kept it, and set the kindling herself. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway before Charlotte had finished, a look of mild reproach on her face that was directed not at Charlotte, but at the housemaid, who had evidently been trusted with the morning fire and had not performed the task. "I'll see to it, Miss Charlotte," Briggs said. "It's nearly done," Charlotte said, and it was. She returned to the writing desk. The accounts showed a deficit in the household linen fund that she had not noticed the previous week, and she set about tracing the discrepancy with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that small errors, left unaddressed, had a way of becoming large ones. She found it in 7 minutes. A double entry for a delivery from the draper in October that had been recorded twice. She corrected it, closed the ledger, and went upstairs to dress for the morning. Her younger sister Nell was already in the upstairs passage, her dark hair only half-pinned, holding a letter she had clearly just received, and reread several times by the creased state of it. Nell was 19 and possessed of a nature so warm and open that Lady Vane found it regularly inconvenient. She looked up when Charlotte appeared and held out the letter. "It is from Mr. Peel's chambers," Nell said, "about father's bequest." Charlotte took the letter and read it. The family solicitor's office in Norwich had sent a notice regarding a small provision their father had separately arranged for Nell, a sum of £140, set aside in a secondary instrument of the will that had not been addressed at the time of probate. The notice was written in the dense, cheerful obscurity of the legal profession, and would have required considerable correspondence to decipher. Charlotte folded it carefully. "Leave it with me," she said. "I'll write to Mr. Peel this week." Nell took the letter back, looked at it once more and nodded. She said nothing else, but she reached out and pressed Charlotte's hand briefly before she went back to her room to finish her hair, and Charlotte thought there was something in that gesture worth more than most of the conversations the morning room produced. It was on that same morning that the rain came in hard off the fens, a cold November rain that came sideways and turned the high street into a running stream by 10 o'clock. Charlotte had gone to the bookshop on a small errand, a volume of plant drawings she had ordered 3 weeks prior for Nell's birthday, and she collected it wrapped in brown paper and stepped out to find the rain had doubled since she entered. She stood under the shallow overhang of the shop door and considered her options, which were few. A man was standing a little way along the street with no coat over his shoulders and no covering of any kind. A leather case under one arm and a sheaf of papers he was attempting to shield against his chest. He was looking at the papers with an expression of focused calm that Charlotte found slightly incongruous, given the state of the rain. He appeared to be somewhere past 30, with the bearing of a man accustomed to being out of doors in all weather, and his hands, she noticed, were quite still even as the rain drove against him. Charlotte considered the umbrella she was carrying. It had been her father's, a sturdy article of dark green oilcloth with a carved handle, and it was large enough to cover 2 people in a moderate rain, and the current rain was no longer moderate. She stepped out from the overhang and walked toward the man. "You're going to ruin your papers," she said. He looked up. His eyes were grey, the specific grey of stone in low light, and he regarded her for a moment with an attention that was neither rude nor familiar, but simply complete, as though he were reading something she had not known she had written. "I suspect I am," he said. "Then come under here," Charlotte said, and held the umbrella out at an angle that made the invitation unmistakable without making it theatrical. He stepped under it. He shifted the leather case to his other arm to accommodate the closer distance, and folded the papers more securely. The rain clattered against the oilcloth above them. They walked because there was nothing else to do in a shared umbrella during a November downpour, toward the coaching inn at the end of the high street where the overhang was wider. "You are the steward newly come to look at Brentfield," Charlotte said. It was not a question, because in a village the size of Alderton there was only one set of rooms recently taken, and only one stranger with a leather case who might be standing in the high street on a Tuesday morning with papers he could not afford to get wet. "Edmund Ashford," he said. "At Brentfield on behalf of the new owner, yes." "Charlotte Vane. My family is at Vane House on the Brentfield boundary." He inclined his head with the kind of precise courtesy that a well-trained steward might offer a neighbour's daughter, and yet the gesture had a quality to it that Charlotte could not quite name, a natural authority in the small motion of it, as though the courtesy were the abbreviated form of something considerably more elaborate. She filed this observation away as irrelevant and released it. They parted at the coaching inn overhang. She pressed the umbrella into his hands when he made to return it, saying her house was close enough, and she would manage, and walked home through the thinning rain, with the parcel of Nell's book under her arm, and the particular satisfaction of having done a small, ordinary thing that cost her nothing except the damp hem of her grey wool dress. Lady Vane was in the morning room when Charlotte returned, which was unusual enough to be noticed. She was seated at the table with an expression Charlotte associated with announcements, and across the table sat Sir Gerald Mott. Sir Gerald Mott was 44 years old, pink at the jowls and emphatic about everything. A man whose opinion of himself was so firmly established that he had long since ceased to find it necessary to solicit the opinions of others. He owned a middling property in the next parish, and was known in the district for his horse and for his debts, though the latter were discussed only in the careful language of implication. He rose when Charlotte entered and made her a bow that managed to convey both condescension and expectations simultaneously, which Charlotte considered a minor feat. "Charlotte," her mother said with the particular warmth she reserved for pronouncements. "Sir Gerald has been so kind as to call this morning. He has spoken to me on a matter that I am very pleased to tell you has been entirely settled." Charlotte stood with the wet parcel in her hands and did not say anything. She had learned some time ago that silence on these occasions was more economical than questions. "Sir Gerald and I have agreed the principal terms of a settlement between your households," Lady Vane said. "You are to be betrothed." Sir Gerald smiled. It was the smile of a man who had won something and was pleased to let the room know it. Charlotte looked at her mother for a moment. Then she excused herself, set the parcel on the hall table outside the door, and went upstairs to remove her damp dress. She was perfectly quiet while she did it. It was Briggs who told her the rest. Not intentionally, not all at once, and not in so many words. But Briggs had been in this household for 17 years, and she had the housekeeper's particular relationship with truth. She did not lie, but she did not volunteer. And so the things she said in half-sentences near the kitchen passage when she thought Charlotte was out of earshot had the quality of truths making their own way into the air. Charlotte heard it through the morning room door 3 days after the betrothal was announced. She had come downstairs to retrieve a letter she had left on the writing desk, and she heard her mother's voice with the clipped precision it took when Lady Vane was explaining something she had already decided and did not wish to re-examine. "The £800 was the whole of it," her mother said to someone in the room Charlotte could not see. "There is nothing left to attach to the settlement. I disposed of it in September to cover what was owed on the house and the Banbury account, and it is done. Sir Gerald has been told there is no separate sum coming to Charlotte, and he has agreed to proceed regardless. The title will be sufficient inducement." A pause, then Briggs's voice lower. "And Miss Charlotte does not know." "She has no need to know," Lady Vane said. "It was my administration of her father's estate to manage as I saw fit, and I have managed it. The girl will be well enough placed as Lady Mott. She is not sentimental about money." Charlotte stood on the other side of that door for a moment that seemed to occupy considerably more than a moment. The £800 had been her father's last clear provision for her, the sum her mother had always cited as Charlotte's recommendation, and it was gone. It had been gone since September, spent on household debts she had known nothing of, and she was to marry Sir Gerald Mott, not because there was a dowry to negotiate with, but because the marriage could proceed without one. She took her letter from the hall table and went back upstairs. She sat at the small writing desk in her own room for a long time, looking at the fire without feeding it, while the room grew cold around her. Edmund Ashford came to Brentfield twice in the week after the umbrella incident, and each time he found occasion to walk the boundary of the Brentfield grounds that ran alongside the lane Charlotte used on her way to the village. This was not a coincidence, though Charlotte, had she examined it, would have attributed it to the practicalities of a land steward's work. He was measuring the fence lines, recording the drainage of the lower field, making notes in a small book with a pencil that he kept in the inside pocket of his coat. The coat was a plain, dark wool, well made but not showy, the kind of coat a prosperous steward or a country solicitor might wear without attracting comment. He raised his hat when she passed. She returned the courtesy. On the second occasion, she was walking back from the village with a basket of provisions, because the housemaid had been sent on another errand, and he fell into step beside her for the length of the lane, which was perhaps a quarter of a mile. "You know this countryside well," he said, because she had taken the shortcut through the Brentfield stile without breaking stride, the gait of which required a specific lift and push sequence that only someone familiar with it would have known. "I have walked this way since I was a child," Charlotte said. "My father and yours used to walk here together, I think." She paused. "Forgive me, I do not know who owns Brentfield now." "A gentleman from the north," Edmund said with a precision that was technically accurate. "He has not been down to see the property yet." "He should," Charlotte said. "The lower field drains poorly after rain, which will affect any plans for the south pasture. And the kitchen garden has been neglected for 2 seasons. Someone should look to it before spring." Edmund wrote something in the small book. Charlotte looked at him sideways. "You are noting that down," she said. "It seemed worth noting," he said. She smiled briefly and without display, and they reached the Vane house gate, and she went in. She encountered him twice more before the letter to the solicitor. Once at the Brentfield library, which the absent owner had apparently given Edmund leave to use, and where Charlotte had arrived one grey afternoon to return a borrowed atlas that had belonged to the old Brentfield household before the estate changed hands. Edmund was at the reading table with a map spread open before him, his coat over the back of the chair, His waistcoat a dark grey wool that sat with the easy exactness of clothes, cut by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. He stood when she entered, which was the correct form, and offered her the reading chair, which was the surplus of it. "I will only be a moment," Charlotte said, setting the atlas on the shelf where it belonged. She paused with her hand on the spine. "My father used to say the maps in this library were the best in 3 parishes." "He was correct," Edmund said. "The 1798 county survey is particularly good. Are you interested in cartography, Miss Vane?" "Competent rather than interested," Charlotte said. "My father thought women ought to be able to read a map. He was slightly in advance of his district on several points." She was not trying to make anything of this. She spoke about her father the way she spoke about the drainage in the lower field, as something factual that deserved to be accurately described. Edmund watched her cross to the door, and there was a quality in his stillness as he watched that Charlotte, from her position near the threshold, could not see. The atlas remained where she had placed it on the shelf, and the afternoon light from the library window fell across the map on his table, and neither of them said anything else before she left. The second occasion was at the bookshop again, where she had come to inquire about a medical pamphlet for a neighbour whose wife was unwell, and Edmund had been there before her, returning a volume he had borrowed from the proprietor. They stood together for a few minutes while the proprietor searched his shelves, and Edmund picked up a volume from the display table and turned it in his hands, and Charlotte noticed that the way he handled a book was the way someone handles a familiar object, a person who has spent a great deal of time among books, not a man who has spent his life walking fields. She noticed this and then dismissed it. She had a letter to write. The letter to Mr. Peel in Norwich had been on her mind for a week. She wrote it on a Thursday evening in her own room by candlelight, the household accounts closed and pushed aside, a clean sheet of paper before her. She set out the situation clearly. The notice from Mr. Peel's chambers regarding the separate provision for Nell, her wish to ensure that the sum was properly administered, and her request that Mr. Peel correspond directly with her rather than with Lady Vane on this particular matter. This last point was not without consequence. Lady Vane considered all family correspondence her province and would not receive it warmly if she learned that Charlotte had written to the solicitor on a separate track, on Nell's behalf, without first consulting her. Charlotte knew this. She wrote the letter anyway, sealed it, and addressed it in her clearest hand, and gave it to the post in the morning without telling anyone. She was not performing heroism. She was writing a letter for her sister because no one else was going to write it. And Nell's £140, which was not a large sum but was Nell's sum, placed in trust for her by a father who had loved her, deserved to be properly accounted for. Edmund was not there to see it. She had no expectation that he would hear of it. She sealed the letter and put it in the post because it was the right thing to do, and because her father had taught her that small right things done without audience were the ones that made the most solid ground underfoot. Lady Vane found out about the letter 4 days later, through what avenue Charlotte was never quite certain, though the suspicion pointed toward the village postmistress and her habits of observation. The consequence was a 20-minute scene in the morning room in which Lady Vane explained at length that Charlotte had no business conducting correspondence with the family solicitor independently, that Nell's small provision was a minor matter requiring no separate action, and that Charlotte had shown a degree of presumption that was particularly ill-timed, given her current situation. Charlotte listened. She did not apologize, which she recognized was the point on which Lady Vane's lecture finally ran aground, because an apology would have allowed the scene to conclude tidily, and the absence of one left it unfinished in a way her mother found uncomfortable. "You are too old for these gestures," Lady Vane said, which was not what she meant. What she meant was, You are too available to be indulged. Sir Gerald has called again this morning, and you were not in the drawing room. I was in the kitchen garden, Charlotte said, which was accurate. She had been assessing what remained of the autumn planting and making notes for whoever might wish to restore it in the spring. She had not, when she went to the kitchen garden, thought of Edmund's observations about the Brentfield kitchen garden, though the connection was there if she had wished to find it. You should be in the drawing room, her mother said. You should be where Sir Gerald can see you. The settlement is not yet signed. I understand, Charlotte said. She did understand. She understood it completely and specifically, in all its weight. The settlement was not yet signed, the dowry was already gone, and the only thing keeping Sir Gerald Mott's interest engaged was the prospect of a wife he considered sufficiently decorative and sufficiently tractable. Charlotte was 23 years old in November of 1823, with no dowry, an arranged betrothal, and a letter in the post that had cost her the last of her mother's goodwill. She went back to the kitchen garden and finished her notes. Edmund Ashford had been in Alderton for 3 weeks when his secretary arrived. The secretary was a young man named Harker, who came from the north by post-chaise on a cold Tuesday afternoon, and presented himself at Brentfield to find Edmund not there, but at the Vane house, where he had called on a small matter of the boundary fence, a section of which had been found to overlap what the old survey maps placed as the edge of the Vane kitchen garden. The overlap was 3 feet at most and had likely been undisputed for 30 years, but it was the kind of thing a thorough land steward would note and bring to the attention of the neighbouring household. He had been shown into the drawing room by Briggs, who regarded him with the steady neutrality she extended to everyone who came through the door, and Charlotte had come down from upstairs to receive him, because Lady Vane was out paying calls and Nell was at her music. They were standing at the side table with the survey map spread between them, discussing the boundary question with the practical ease of 2 people who both understood the relevant facts, when Harker was admitted. The young man walked into the drawing room, travel-worn and slightly flustered from the journey, looked at Edmund and said, without preamble and without any apparent awareness that it might require preamble, "My lord, I have the papers you requested from the Norwich offices." The room did not go entirely still, because it contained only Charlotte, Briggs at the door, and the map on the side table. But something in it changed. Charlotte looked at Edmund. He was looking at Harker with an expression that was composed and entirely unrevealing, and he did not immediately correct the address. The papers in Harker's hand bore a wax seal that Charlotte could read from where she stood, because her father had taught her to read seals the way he had taught her to read maps, carefully and without assumption. The seal was a bird in an oval field with lettering beneath it. She read the lettering, Ravenscroft. She looked at the seal for a moment, then she looked at Edmund. He was watching her read it, and when their eyes met he did not look away, and the expression on his face was the one she associated with his stillness in the library. A quiet, complete attention, as though he had been waiting for this moment with a patience that was not resigned, but simply certain. "Edmund Ashford," she said very quietly. "Ashford of Ravenscroft." "Yes," he said. He said it without decoration, the smallest sufficient word. "The Earl of Ravenscroft." She had heard the name in the context of the Northern Estates, the Ravenscroft title and its associated lands, which were considerable. She had not connected it to the man standing in her drawing room with a survey map spread on the side table. She had connected nothing. She had seen a man who handled books with familiarity and wore plain wool with the ease of someone who had never needed clothes to announce him, and she had thought steward. She had thought sensible, capable, familiar with the countryside in all weathers. She had thought, recently, and without wishing to examine it closely, that he was the person she found herself most easily honest with. more honest than she was with most people she had known for years. She folded this understanding away for the moment because Harker was still standing with the papers, and Briggs was in the doorway, and the drawing room required something more immediate than private reckoning. "Briggs," Charlotte said, "please bring Mr. Harker some tea. He has come a long way." Briggs, who had understood the shape of what had just happened with the swift, unceremonious competence of 17 years in service, withdrew to do exactly that. Lady Vane returned from her calls at 3:30 in the company of her close acquaintance Mrs. Farrow and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Cleeve, because Lady Vane preferred an audience for domestic arrangements and had cultivated the habit of returning from afternoon calls with company. Sir Gerald Mott arrived shortly afterward, having been apparently expected, though Charlotte had not been told of the plan. The drawing-room filled with the comfortable authority Lady Vane assumed when she had an audience she trusted. Edmund was still in the house. Harker had taken tea in the small parlour, and Edmund had remained in the drawing-room at Charlotte's word, though she could not afterwards say exactly why she had asked it, only that it seemed correct, the way the letter to Mr. Peel had seemed correct, without any precise accounting of the outcome. Lady Vane entered the drawing-room, saw Edmund, and assumed with her native social fluency that he was a steward come about the boundary fence, which Charlotte had mentioned that morning as a possibility. She was gracious in a way that was calibrated to his perceived station, pleasantly condescending. The warmth of a woman who knew how to manage people she considered socially beneath her. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you are kind to call. I hope the boundary matter can be settled without difficulty." Sir Gerald Mott, who had settled himself in the largest chair and was accepting a cup of tea from the housemaid with proprietary ease, regarded Edmund with the comfortable contempt of a man who sorted other men by their coats. Edmund set down his teacup. He did not stand differently than he had stood all afternoon, and yet the quality of it had changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened. "Lady Vane," he said, "I should perhaps clarify something that has been misunderstood." He paused, not from uncertainty, but from the particular economy of a man who chose his words because they were sufficient, not because they were impressive. "I am not a land steward. My name is Edmund Ashford. I hold the earldom of Ravenscroft. I came to Alderton because the Brentfield property has come to me by inheritance, and I chose to assess it myself before announcing my presence in the district." The drawing-room was very quiet. Mrs. Farrow set her cup down with a small sound. Mrs. Cleeve looked at Lady Vane with the bright attention of someone who was going to describe this scene in detail to at least 4 people before the week was out. Lady Vane said nothing, which was the most informative thing she could have done. Her silence had the quality of someone reorganizing a room in their mind while standing still in the middle of it. Sir Gerald Mott made a sound that was not quite a word. "Furthermore," Edmund said, and there was no triumph in his voice, only a steady, clear continuation, the voice of a man finishing a sentence he had decided to complete. "I have a matter to raise regarding Miss Vane." Lady Vane found her voice. "Miss Vane," she said, "is shortly to be settled with Sir Gerald. The terms are nearly arranged." "I am aware of what has been arranged," Edmund said. "I am also aware that Miss Vane's dowry, the £800 settled on her by her father's will, was disposed of in September to meet the household's Banbury account, and that the current settlement with Sir Gerald Mott proceeds on the understanding that no such sum remains." He looked at Lady Vane with a directness that contained no malice and no heat, only the precision of a man stating a thing that was true. "I am also aware, because I have made it my business to inquire, that Sir Gerald Mott's own financial position will not survive scrutiny of his Norfolk creditors." Sir Gerald rose from his chair. His colour was very high. "That is a libel," Sir Gerald said. "It is in the Norwich Register," Edmund said simply. "As of last April." The room sorted itself in silence. Mrs. Farrow and Mrs. Cleeve, who had the social intelligence to understand that they were witnessing something that would not benefit Lady Vane, exchanged a brief look. Briggs appeared in the doorway, and then withdrew, and Charlotte knew from the economy of that withdrawal that Briggs had been listening from the passage and had already understood the shape of the afternoon. Charlotte herself had been standing near the side table since Edmund began speaking. She had not moved and had not said anything. She was not required to move or to say anything. The thing she had always known about herself, the thing that had been systematically misread by everyone in this room who had an interest in misreading it, was being confirmed simply by its own uninterrupted continuity. She had written the letter to Mr. Peel. She had stood under the Brentfield stile and spoken about her father's maps, and returned the atlas to its shelf, and offered an umbrella in the rain with no calculation at all. And here she stood, with no calculation at all. "I would like," Edmund said, turning from Lady Vane to Charlotte with the full and simple directness he had offered every conversation since the umbrella, "to have Miss Vane's leave to call formally, if she is willing." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. She thought of the first morning in the rain, and the leather case, and the papers he had been trying to keep dry. She thought of the way he had noted her observation about the kitchen garden in the small book as a thing worth noting. "You may call," she said. It was a contained sentence in a Regency drawing room in November of 1823, and it held more than most long speeches managed to hold. Lady Vane said something, the beginning of a correction, the social reflex of a woman whose authority had always operated through the unquestioned assumption of the room. It trailed away. The room was no longer hers in the way it had been 5 minutes ago, and she could feel it, the way one feels a change in the temperature of a fire before one can say exactly what has shifted. Sir Gerald Mott left before tea was fully concluded. He made his excuses with the fractured fluency of a man whose script had stopped working mid-scene, and Mrs. Farrow watched him go with an expression that would take several conversations over the next fortnight to fully discharge. Mrs. Cleeve studied the fire with the deliberate attention of someone choosing not to stare. Edmund stayed until the proper leaving time, and no longer, which was the form, and he took his leave of Charlotte at the drawing-room door with a brief, complete look that said the things that the drawing-room did not yet give them room to say. Charlotte returned it with the steadiness she returned everything, and heard the front door close behind him, and the carriage wheels on the gravel of the lane, and the sound of Mrs. Farrow beginning to compose her account of the afternoon for an imagined audience. Nell appeared at Charlotte's elbow, having come downstairs during the latter portion of proceedings, and stood at the back of the room without anyone particularly noticing her, which was a skill she had developed in self-defense. She said nothing. She pressed Charlotte's hand the way she had pressed it in the upstairs passage over the solicitor's letter. The same brief, certain pressure. Charlotte held her hand for a moment, and then went to find Briggs. The housekeeper was in the kitchen passage, precisely where Charlotte had expected her to be, arranging the tea things with the focused irrelevance of a woman who has been listening to the drawing room through the door and needs something to do with her hands. "You heard," Charlotte said. "I heard most of it," Briggs said without embarrassment, because she had never wasted effort on embarrassment when the truth served better. "Your mother will be very quiet this evening." "Yes," Charlotte said. "Mr. Peel's office sent a reply this morning," Briggs said. "It came while you were in the drawing room. I put it on the writing desk in the library." Charlotte went to the library. The room was quiet in the late afternoon light, the fire recently laid and burning low, the smell of old paper and wool and wood smoke that she had associated with her father, and with reading, since childhood. Mr. Peel's reply was on the writing desk, a brief and businesslike letter confirming receipt of her instructions and indicating that the provision for Nell had been properly identified in the estate instrument and would be separately administered as requested. Charlotte set the letter down and looked at it, and then looked out the library window at the Brentfield lane. The light was going in the way November light goes in Norfolk, slowly and without announcement, the hedgerows darkening to black against the pale sky. She would write to Edmund tomorrow. Not a long letter, because she had never been one for long letters when a short one said the thing. But a letter in her clearest hand on proper paper, saying what she meant, which was something she had practiced all her life and had rarely been given leave to do. On the writing desk beside Mr. Peel's reply, she placed a clean sheet of paper and the pen and the ink. She would write it in the morning, in the light, when her hand was steady. The kitchen garden waited below the window. The late autumn beds were cleared and bare, ready for whatever the spring chose to make of them. In the lane beyond the Vane gate, a lantern moved slowly past, someone on foot going home in the dark, and Charlotte watched it until it rounded the corner and disappeared, and the lane was quiet. She put her hand on her father's letter-weight, a small bronze thing in the shape of an acorn that had sat on this writing desk as long as she could remember, and she stood at the window of the library that had always been the room in this house that felt most like hers, and she felt for the first time since September that the ground beneath her was solid.